Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. It's a great pleasure seeing you this morning. This is the first time in about 3-4 months since we had our last forum for 2020. Thanks to coronavirus pandemic, we finally have this IGE monthly forum with you. And as such, I would appreciate your support and cooperation to make our event as safe as possible. Please try to wear a mask as much as possible, except for while you're eating or drink. And also clean your hands with sanitizers we have prepared at the entrance. We try to respect the social distancing guidelines so that you can see many empty spots, because we arranged this deliberately to have a very safe and secure environment for this special occasion. Today, I'm very happy and most privileged to have a distinguished speaker, His Excellency Ambassador Stefan Auer, as our special guest. Ambassador Auer agreed graciously to keep his commitment to this gathering despite the concerns over the ongoing coronavirus issue. We are hoping to invite Ambassador Auer as a special guest this time around because, as you know, this year marks 30th anniversary of the German reunification. I am confident that his exceptional insight will help us better understand Germany's experience with the reunification of the last 30 years and its implications for us in search for peaceful reunification of our own. Before we invite Ambassador Auer to the podium, allow me to say briefly about his excellent credentials. With educational background in legal and political studies at the University of Bonn, Ambassador Auer has built an outstanding diplomatic career at Germany's Federal Foreign Office. Prior to serving as German ambassador to Korea since 2016, he held senior positions at German embassy in United Kingdom, Italy, and EU, European Union, in Brussels. Now, without further ado, let's welcome His Excellency Ambassador Auer. He will speak for about 40 minutes at your disposal, followed by some 20 minutes or so for Q&A from the floor. Thank you. Thank you very much. All yours.
Good morning, Chairman Jun, dear fellow ambassadors and dear friends. Thank you very much for inviting me, and I must say this is the first time I attend such a big gathering after the COVID crisis struck also South Korea. But at the same time, let me also pay tribute to the very efficient and fantastic way the South Korean government has managed to contain the spread of the virus. You're amongst perhaps even the first democracies and open democratic societies who will come out of this crisis. This needs to be said all over again, because we are seeing others who are saying that their system is superior in tackling this virus. You have shown that also in a democratic and open society you can efficiently tackle this. And this I would like to say right from the beginning. It is my great pleasure to be here today and to speak to you about German unification, as you said, we have had on the 9th of November last year, the 30th anniversary of the fall of the wall. And this year we will celebrate the 30th anniversary of the actual unification of Germany on the 3rd of October 2020. We hope to be able to give a big party. Let's hope that COVID allows us to do that. Anyway, as a German diplomat and ambassador, you can imagine that I'm very frequently asked, how did Germany manage to reunify in such a peaceful and democratic manner, and what can Korea learn from it? I'm looking forward to discussing these issues with you, and maybe together we can arrive to answer the difficult question of whether or not there are indeed lessons to be drawn from the German experience for the situation here in Korea. But before I dive into the details, let me first stress that while we have a lot of commonalities between the German and the Korean situation, there are also some fundamental differences, which I would like to point out right from the beginning. The former German Democratic Republic, East Germany, GDR, for example, never waged a war against West Germany. East Germany never attacked West Germany, never developed, threatened with the use of nuclear weapons, and never completely stopped people-to-people contact. On the other hand, I'm also convinced that there are parallels, that parallels do exist. Therefore, some of the experience that we made on our way to unification might serve as a rough guideline. However, what those aspects are exactly is for you to decide. What I would like to get to is to convey to you three key messages. First, today, 30 years after the fall of the Berlin Wall, we can say German unification was or is a success story, politically, economically, and socially. It was not a success, and this is my second message, this is not a success from day one. In order to make it so, Germany had to go through profound and rather painful reforms and efforts, especially in the economic area. Third, German unification was not handed to us on a silver platter. Time and again, Germany had to take the initiative and drive the process forward, sometimes against overwhelming odds. But let me start at the beginning, that is with the situation after the Second World War. One of the most important parallels between the situation in Germany and in Korea lies in the rock-solid alliance with the states of the so-called Western Hemisphere, above all the United States of America. Now, you all know that after the World War II, the Allies partitioned Berlin and Germany's remaining territory into 4 military occupied zones. The western sectors were merged in May 1949 from the Federal Republic of Germany, while in October 1949 the Soviet zone became the German Democratic Republic. When Konrad Adenauer, a Christian Democrat, was elected as the first chancellor in West Germany, he might have been tempted to choose a policy of neutrality towards the Eastern and Western Bloc in order to try and bring about German unification much quicker. However, he rigorously withstood this temptation of a German third way. In fact, with Germany's so-called West integration into NATO and with the beginning of European integration in the 1950s, the national division of Germany was sealed for the time being. But Adenauer chose to follow down that road nevertheless. As we know today, these steps were crucial in gaining the Western Allies' trust and loyalty later on, when West Germany needed their support for its far-reaching policies towards East Germany and the Soviet bloc. In other words, the unequivocal orientation towards the West was a key prerequisite for Germany's future development. At the same time, however, it became soon clear that West and East Germany would need more than just deterrence and containment in order to foster national rapprochement. Rather, what was needed to break out of the Cold War inherent logic of bloc thinking was the fundamental readjustment of foreign and security policy. The key event that would lead to this fundamental shift in policy was the building of the Berlin Wall in 1961, that would run like a scar through Berlin for the next 28 years and become the hallmark of German partition. To be more precise, it was the helplessness with which the West German government had to watch and let it happen. The United States did not want to risk a war with the Soviet Union over the issue, and Germany and West Germany was caught between two blocks. You may say, like a shrimp between two whales. What became more and more clear was that all actors involved had to break out of the Cold War logic of bloc confrontation and start building trust towards each other. Otherwise, German partition might last forever. However, this readjustment was not initiated by Germany's allies. It had to be kickstarted by the West German government. To be more specific, it was the fourth German Chancellor Willy Brandt, a social democrat, who reset the political landscape with the initiative of his so-called Ostpolitik, which is in English more or less New Eastern policy. At its core, what the Ostpolitik tried to achieve was the normalization of relations between West Germany and Eastern Europe. Its ultimate goal, however, was to allow for people-to-people contacts between the two German states again. In other words, Brandt wanted to make the wall more permeable. The Ostpolitik was initiated in 1969. It contained some very courageous decisions that would eventually lead to a massive easing of tensions between the two blocs in Europe. At first, however, it meant making major concessions towards Moscow and the GDR, especially regarding territorial claims. The easing of tensions with the East necessarily had to start with the Soviet Union. In 1970, Brandt signed the Treaty of Moscow, recognizing the current European borders. Later that year, Germany then signed the Treaty of Warsaw, which recognized Germany's bilateral border with Poland as it stands today. Later, treaties with other Eastern European countries would follow. The most controversial agreement, however, came in 1972. It was the so-called Basic Treaty with East Germany that established formal relations between the two German states for the first time since partition. This was a major step, especially because West Germany claimed to represent the entire German nation. Chancellor Brandt tried to smooth over this point by stating that although two states exist in Germany, they cannot regard one another as foreign countries. However, and this is important, although Willy Brandt was openly breaking with the confrontational foreign policy of his predecessors, he never allowed any doubt that the Federal Republic of Germany would remain firmly embedded within the Western Alliance. This principle would remain something that Brandt and his successors would continue to hold on even against pressure from within. This was especially true in the realm of security politics, and it included some painful steps. In 1979, for example, Chancellor Helmut Schmidt supported and implemented the so-called NATO double-track decision that would lead to the deployment of additional medium-range nuclear weapons in Europe. It is important to note that he did this against enormous protest from West German citizens. As a short-term result, the Ostpolitik seemed to cement German partition, to solidify it. At that time, nobody believed that no unification would ever be possible. In the long run, however, the Ostpolitik's principle of détente and exchange helped create the favorable environment that would pave the road for events in 1989. Multilaterally, the policy also created the momentum for some very important security policy-related processes, most notably the so-called Helsinki Accords of 1975. These accords established a crucial system of specific rules of engagement that would prove decisive for Germany's future path. They included, amongst others, the inviolability of frontiers, the peaceful settlement of disputes, a non-intervention in internal affairs, and the respect for human rights and fundamental freedoms. For the inner German context, the Ostpolitik's main goal was to stop the drifting apart of Germans that lived on both sides of the wall and increase people-to-people contacts. Willy Brandt's hope was that this policy would lead to a change through rapprochement, Wandel durch Annäherung, as we say in German, between the German states. And in fact, in this regard, this policy would be a sweeping success. However, Brandt's Ostpolitik was also highly controversial in Germany, most importantly, because it included huge payments that helped stabilize the East German system. One example is the often referred to is in this context the so-called Freikauf, buying of freedom, a means by which West Germany literally bought political detainees out of GDR prisons. Until 1989, more than 31,000 East German prisoners were bought into freedom this way. For each and every one of them, West Germany paid 25,000 to 55,000 US dollars. Every year, the GDR would also receive roughly 2.5 billion Deutschmarks of transit fees for cars and trains that would pass from West Germany to West Berlin, transiting East Germany. At the same time, however, the number of people-to-people contacts between the two states did increase, and enormously so. For the first time since the wall was built, people from East Germany were allowed to visit their relatives in the West, and vice versa. From 72 to 85, the number of East Germans that would travel to the West was between 1 million and 1.7 million every year. People were allowed to call each other on the telephone, and they did. In 72, 700,000 calls were made between the two German states. In 1983, the number has risen to 23.2 million. About 90% of East Germans could listen to West German radio, and a good portion, although illegally, could also receive West German TV signals. So in the end, the Ostpolitik had two major consequences. East Germans were not cut off from the outside world anymore. And second, when the time came, they started to demand the same rights and freedoms they knew existed in the West, something that became known as the Peaceful Revolution. In this context, the impact of the former General Secretary of the CPSU, Mikhail Gorbachev, and his democratic reform agenda had on Germany's way to national unification can hardly be overestimated. Gorbachev's most important decision was to give up the Soviet claim of leadership over the internal developments of his socialist brotherlands. This included abolishing the so-called Brezhnev Doctrine, a policy that in the past had allowed for military intervention by the Soviet Union in the case of civil unrest. As a consequence, several states in the Eastern Bloc, like Poland, Hungary, and Czechoslovakia, initiated their own reform agendas and started opening up. However, this was not the case in East Germany, where the regime tried to cling to its socialist agenda with all its might and did not allow for major reforms. This, in turn, led to two significant developments. The first development was that for the first time in a long time, East German citizens dared to form oppositional groups and to demand civil rights and democratic reforms. These protests became known as the so-called Monday demonstrations, where tens of thousands of East Germans, sometimes even several hundreds of thousands, would gather in cities like Leipzig, Dresden, or Berlin, and other many places. The most famous chant of these demonstrations became "Wir sind das Volk," we are the people. With this slogan, the protesters reminded their leaders that the democratic republic has to be ruled by the people and not by an undemocratic party claiming to represent them. In the coming weeks, these demonstrations put more and more pressure on the regime. And the second development was that in the course of this reformist agenda, Hungary began to seize military control of its borders in May 1989. All of a sudden, there was a gap in the Iron Curtain. This gave East German citizens the opportunity to flee into the West via the border between Hungary and Austria. Tens of thousands did so within a few days, and without the support of the Soviet Union, the GDR regime had extreme problems stopping them. The uncontrolled exodus of East German citizens soon became such a problem that the GDR decided that a new travel law was needed. The intention was to allow more East Germans to travel to West Germany, but only after an application had been approved. The intention of this was to buy time. Only 4 million East Germans had passport, so only that number could take immediate advantage of such a change. The remaining 13 million would have to apply for a passport and then wait for at least 4 weeks to get a passport. This new travel law was supposed to go into effect from the morning of the 10th of November 1989 in a controlled and supervised manner. However, on the evening of the 9th of November 1989, there was a televised press conference. In this press conference, a man named Günter Schabowski, who was a member of GDR's Politburo, had to explain the new rules to the world. However, Mr. Schabowski had not been present in the room of the Politburo when that decision was taken. So when a reporter asked him when the new rules would be applied, he answered, slightly irritated, "As far as I know, it's immediately, without delay," although it had to come into force the next day only. The consequences of this error were enormous. Within hours, thousands of people gathered at the Berlin Wall, demanding that the border guards open the gates. The guards were unable to contact their superiors for instructions, and because they feared a stampede, they opened the gates. The iconic scenes that followed were broadcast worldwide. People pouring into West Berlin, standing on the wall and attacking it with pickaxes. And with this, after more than 28 years, the Berlin Wall had fallen. Soon afterwards, the GDR regimes would collapse too. But of course, the end of the wall and the fall of the Socialist Party did not mean immediate unification for Germany. Helmut Kohl, who would go down in history as the Chancellor of Unification, was cautious at first. On 28th of November 1989, he pronounced his famous 10-point program. The program included ideas of future contract association between the German states and later on confederal structures. There was not a single word about unification. However, with the opening up of the Berlin Wall, the Monday demonstration in East Germany did not stop. On the contrary, they continued steadily in the coming weeks and months, but the key demand changed. The famous slogan, "We are the people," changed into "We are one people." The clear and loud message of these protesters would tip the scale. It became clear very soon that Helmut Kohl's initial proposal for confederative structures between the two German states was not reaching far enough. East Germans wanted actual unification. Because of the now open borders, the political instability, and the disastrous economic situation in East Germany, even the GDR's government had to give in to this trajectory. As a direct result, the GDR proclaimed the first free and democratic elections in East Germany ever in March 1990. It comes as no surprise that the overwhelming victory in these elections would go to an alliance of a party called Alliance for Germany that was clearly in favor of a timely German reunification. By now, the government under Chancellor Helmut Kohl also wanted to seize this historic opportunity. However, merely being in favor of unification would not do the trick. Remember that the two German states still did not have complete national sovereignty. And so also they required the agreement of the four former occupying powers if they wanted to reunify. And achieving the joint blessing from Moscow, Washington, Paris, and London was a tough task. Once again, the West German government had to take the initiative. In the coming months, Chancellor Helmut Kohl worked hard to solve the difficult and complex issues that stood in the way of unification from a foreign policy perspective. This process would come to be known as the so-called 2+4 negotiations, since they involved both German states as well as the four former occupying powers. For a start, Helmut Kohl had to bring France and Britain around. Both states were extremely skeptical of the idea of a reunified Germany that could possibly turn into a European hegemony once again. In this context, West Germany's steadfast position as an ally to the United States proved vital. With the help of George Bush Sr., First President Bush, Paris and London could finally be convinced to support unification. As reassurance, however, Washington demanded that the reunified Germany would have to be part of the EU and, more importantly, of NATO. Good luck convincing the Soviets of that. However, in an almost miraculous turn of events, Gorbachev agreed even to this point. In return, however, Germany would have to agree to a number of terms. Among those were the following. First, there would be no NATO troops stationed on the former East German territory. Germany, second, would have to pay for the withdrawal and redeployment of Soviet troops. These were tough concessions, but in the end, they opened the way for unification. On 12th of September 1990, all parties signed a treaty that would allow for a unified Germany. On this basis, the governments of West and East Germany then signed a unification treaty and decided the former GDR would join the Federal Republic of Germany on 3rd of October 1990, so 30 years ago. So in terms of international law, German unification was complete. The speed in which all of this went down was breathtaking and, quite frankly, somewhat overwhelming. It sometimes forced those in charge to make decisions which were politically necessary at the time, but which would cause incredible stress for the reunified Germany in the decades to come. This was especially true in the economic area. Very shortly after the fall of the Berlin Wall, and months ahead of actual unification, there was a new slogan in the GDR used by hundreds of thousands of protesters. It went something like, if the Deutsche Mark comes to us, we will stay here. If it does not, we will go and visit her. What this meant was that now that borders were open, East Germans had achieved self-determination, they also wanted a better economic future. And if they could not get that in East Germany, there was now nothing preventing them from simply packing up their stuff and moving to the West. This, of course, presented an enormous risk for the still very young unification process. In fact, there was a great danger that East Germans would leave the GDR in an uncontrolled mass migration and that it could lead to the closing of the borders once again. In fact, remember that the Berlin Wall was built for very similar reasons in 1961 in the first place. For the West German government, the situation created an enormous pressure to act, economically, politically, as well as socially. As a consequence, 3 core decisions were made that would have a great impact on future developments. First, already in May 1990, so a couple of months before actual political unification, the 2 German states agreed on a monetary, economic, and social union. This basically meant an emergency merger of the 2 German economies. Second, the creation of a special trust agency that would privatize East German state enterprises. This was created in June 1990 and oversaw the restructuring and selling of about 8,500 state-owned companies with over 4 million employees. And third, the decision to invest heavily into the long-term rebuilding of the economy and infrastructure in the former East German states. This goal was, and still is, to achieve an equal standard of living in East and West. Now, in terms of economic risk, the decision to go for a de facto economic merger with a currency and social union was by far the most dangerous one. Already in June 1990, the Deutsche Mark was introduced in East Germany with a 1-to-1 ratio for wages and pensions. If you look at this decision merely from a macroeconomic point of view, this was ludicrous. At the beginning of the year 1990, wages and salaries in the GDR stood at roughly 7% compared to West German standard. At the end of the same year, they had already increased by 500%. However, because productivity in East German companies was usually only a fraction of what it was in West Germany, the costs of production soon became way too high in East Germany. In fact, after unification, the economy in East Germany went into shock in multiple ways. With regard to free market competition, in terms of necessary labor market reforms, and with respect to economic transformation. Industrial production in the former GDR fell by roughly 50% between 1989 and the autumn of 1990. Until April 91, it decreased further to a mere 30% of its level of 1989. Overall, East German production was unable to recover throughout the whole of the 90s. At the same time, other Eastern European countries were opening up to foreign investors, and it soon turned out that places like Poland, Czechoslovakia, and Slovenia were a lot more attractive for investors from the West and West Germany than the highly expensive East German states. Also, with respect to the labor market, things changed drastically over 1989. In West Germany, the economy boomed because the government poured money into the reconstruction of the East, and that work was mostly done by West German companies. As a consequence, the jobless rate in the West fell. In the East, however, quite to the contrary, more than 2.5 million people lost their jobs between 1989 and 1991. And things only got worse. Until 95, around 80% of the working population in the former GDR lost their employment temporarily or permanently. The government tried to combat this. Between 1990 and 1991, more than 440,000 jobs creation measures were initiated in the new federal states in order to lower the jobless rate, working hours reduced, and more than 800,000 people that were older than 55 were sent into early retirement. But of course, this in turn only put more strain on the public pension funds. At the same time, the jobless rate stayed high so that the cost of unemployment insurance rose and rose. So overall, this transformation of the former GDR from a planned economy to a free market system was a huge shock for East Germans. The economic insecurity and the massive changes in their lives expressed itself most clearly in the declining fertility rate. Whereas in 1990, East Germans' birth rate stood at 1.5 children per female citizen, fertility dropped by almost 50% until 95. Moreover, more than 1.4 million East German citizens left their homes and moved to the West between 1990 and 94. The government tried to react to the social problem with specific transfer payments within the framework of the so-called social union. The costs of this were immense. Up until today, roughly 2 trillion euros have been paid as transfer measures, and year by year this amount grows by around 100 billion euros. However, out of this total amount, only 300 billion are invested in infrastructure projects or in boosting East German enterprises. The overwhelming part, around 1 trillion euros, is spent for pension funds and unemployment insurance. As you can see, the monetary, economic, and social union put German state finances under massive stress. The additional burden was shouldered in part through new taxes or cross-allocation between the pension and social funds. For the greatest part, however, it was financed through new debt. All of this together led to a long-term negative economic development, at the end of which Germany became to be known the sick man of Europe. It was only under Chancellor Gerhard Schröder that Germany finally managed to turn the wheel around. Schröder proposed the new famous Agenda 2010, a program that focused on a number of painful reforms in the areas of wage policy, social policy, and austerity. The measures he introduced soon created tangible results. The number of unemployed sank from 5 million in 2005 to 3 million in 2008. And even in 2008, when the world was hit by the gigantic financial crisis, this jobless rate did not rise significantly. In 2013, German national debt went down for the first time since 1950. Overall, these reforms turned Germany from being the sick man of Europe into the economic powerhouse it is today. So where do we stand today? So where does all of this leave us today? Politically, economically, and in terms of international relations, reunification was indeed a blessing for Germany. Among these, political integration succeeded most quickly. With Angela Merkel, we have a chancellor from East Germany. And with Joachim Gauck, we also had a federal president from the East. Both internally and externally, Germany has found peace. Economically speaking, we are stronger today than before unification. However, challenges remain. On the bright side, more and more regions in East Germany are picking up economically, especially in the old industrial centers. Even so, economic differences remain. East Germany's industrial sector is smaller than its counterpart in the West, and East German companies are less export-oriented in their businesses. Nevertheless, in its entirety, German economy is pretty well off. When it comes to domestic migration between East and West Germany, the balance was equal in 2012 for the first time, and in 2014, more people actually moved from West to East than the other way around. With respect to fertility rates, more children are now born in East Germany than in the West, and the jobless rate in the East has reached its lowest level since 1991. On the other hand, the Agenda 2010 also had its negative side effects. Discrepancies in wages have increased sharply, temporary employment and labor leasing are on the rise. As a consequence, a lot of job takers are left without unemployment insurance. So economically speaking, we still have a few years ahead of us until the situation in the East will be comparable to the one in the West. In the end, we'll probably say 40 years of bleeding, 40 years of healing. And with this, I would like to thank you for your attention and open the floor for any questions you might have. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Ambassador, for your very informative and insightful speech. Quite frankly, I think the ambassador's presentation just before was perhaps most compelling and authoritative account of German reunification. So for that, very much appreciate your help, and I would like to invite questions from the floor. Yes, Mr. Kim?
Since I'm at least 2 meters away from everybody, I dispense with my mask for asking the questions. Thank you very much for your very incisive speech. When the nation is divided and strive for toward reunifications, one of the important factors, of course, is the people's desire itself. Of course, you know, in Germany and Korea, we are very much similar in the sense that we went through the external elements, and Germany was much more favorable compared to Korea now. But I want to focus on the inner feeling of the people. One of the strong feelings in West Germany was that, as you said, we are one people, one nation, we got to get together. West Germany was very much prepared to make sacrifices to make the nation together. But it's curious to think about it. In 1945, it's only 79 years since Germany and Austria was separated after the Austro-Prussian War of 1866. Korea is now separated north and south 77 years. So I'm struck by the similarity of the time length. And there never was very much strong emotional expressions either in Austria and in Germany saying that we are same people. How do you account for the difference? And why Germans were so anxious to unite East and West, but the thought never really occurs to them about Austria and Germany. Thank you.
I look at my Austrian friend, Michael Schwarzinger. In fact, you know, the thing is that we have had German unification and a German country from 1871, more or less. So we've, at that time, and quickly before that also, there was a question, of course, how should Germans or German-speaking people unite? We always had a lot of counties, territorial states within Central Europe. So there was not really a concept of, you know, Germany. But at that time, in the middle of the 19th century, there were discussion of a big German thing or a smaller German solution. And at the end of the day, the idea of a smaller German state entity carried the day and developed into what became known as the German Empire under the German emperors, Prussian emperors, which formed then the German Empire, as I said. And the unity with Austrian was never followed up until, unfortunately, during the Third Reich, Austria was annexed by Hitler, who himself was an Austrian, and formed this huge German Reich during the Second World War. When the Germans took to the streets in 1989, They remembered, of course, the state as it was before the Second World War, since 1871. And they also remembered that they lived together. And you have to keep in mind that if you go through Berlin and you walk the streets, you can still see the marks of the wall. So you could literally see that a country was really torn apart by the division. Just imagine you would build a wall through Seoul, and families would be divided. You wouldn't be able to see from one day to the other your father or your brother or your sister or your children. This creates quite a shock. And because Willy Brandt was intended to re-establish this people-to-people contact, these links between the Germans in the East and West were never severed. They always continued. And when the occasion arose in 1989 with Gorbachev's reform agenda and with the easing of the clampdown on its own people, the people took to the streets and chanted they want to be reunited again. Not from the beginning, as I said in my speech. In the beginning, they wanted to have political freedoms, and then they wanted to have a unification. So this is perhaps an attempt to explain things, why Germans, East Germans in particular, after the fall of the wall, wanted to reunite with their West German brothers and sisters. This is also partly true to the fact that the division didn't last as long as it did here in Korea, or as it does here in Korea. German unification came about in '89, that is 40 years after the division of Germany in two states. So this is perhaps an explanation for that.
Thank you. Got to you.
Thank you very much. I really appreciate your eloquent speech and insightful presentations. My name is Yu Jang-hee. I'm a professor emeritus of Ewha University. I was going to ask about the general national sentiment, ideological kind of environment in West Germany at the time of the divided Germany. Was there any conflicts between democratic capitalism versus communism within West Germany? I am asking this question because in Korea right now, the South Korea itself is kind of divided between pro-North Korean and versus anti-North Korea. In my memory, at the time of the Germans' division, it seems to be there wasn't any kind of ideological conflicts within West Germany. How would you compare that condition in Germany and in Korea? Thank you.
Well, thank you for this very good question, because indeed this is a difference between our two situations. Indeed, in Germany, not from the beginning, but after Willy Brandt's policy of Ostpolitik was initiated and accepted, there was a consensus that we would follow that Ostpolitik for the time being. Helmut Kohl, and this is the irony of the history, Helmut Kohl was a Christian Democrat, reaped the fruits of a social democratic chancellor's Ostpolitik. There was a consensus in West Germany that we would need to try to make the wall more permeable, to make living conditions better for East Germans. But to be honest, nobody really thought that unification would come about. And there was also in the beginning, before there was a consensus, a big confrontation between those who said, listen, with all your transfers, you are stabilizing, you're consolidating the East German communist regime which is oppressing East Germans. Why are you doing that? You can argue that way, of course. But at the end of the day, the argument carried the day that you have to make things more, more livable for East Germans. You have to improve their living standards and also their human rights situation. And this is something which has to go hand in hand. You can, and this is what Willy Brandt always said, and all the German chancellors and all German governments, there must be a quid pro quo. If you pay money, if you transfer money to the East German government, you need to have counter measures, such as improvement of the human rights situation for East Germans, communications, possibility of people-to-people contacts, all that. This is the quid pro quo. You can't have the cake and eat it. You have to also give something. And this was a fundamental understanding which everybody shared. But before that, right after the Second World War, we also had this debate. Should we go neutral? There was a social democratic leader who said at that time, let's stay neutral in the center of Europe so that we can allow reunification to come about. Because if we join the Western Alliance, we'll have a division not only of Europe but also of Germany. And this is what actually happened. So indeed, in the beginning, it was also very controversial along these lines. There was perhaps no real party who really sympathized with the East German regime. It was very difficult to do that. I mean, you had, the wall, and you had this. It was so obvious that this regime was discriminating against their citizens, that they were very less better off than in West Germany. So that wasn't really a discussion. But the way how to deal with that was controversial.
Thank you. Please, Mr. Kim.
You are mentioning that it means that in the beginning you have a lot of disputes about Ostpolitik, but as time goes on, you can have some kind of consensus about Brandt's policy. Am I right?
Yeah.
Am I understanding? Okay. In that sense, I'd like to ask that after reunification, currently you have president from East Germany and prime minister from East Germany. If I think that in Korea, for example, if Korea is reunified and if we have a president from North Korea and prime minister from North Korea, is almost unacceptable to my understanding. I'd like to ask you, how come can that happen? What kind of persons are Germans? Usually, ordinary people accept that from the very bottom of your heart, or it's a kind of, political gesture or political, manipulation. The second part is a little bit, don't misunderstand, but for ordinary Korean people, it's almost unacceptable. So I'd like to ask you your frank position, because some people, according to the newspaper, some people in West Germany especially, they are a little bit disappointed after reunification, and most people from East Germany who came to West Germany, they go back to East Germany because they have after they come to West Germany, they have a lot of shocks, because there is a kind of discrimination between West and East. So it's a kind of disappointment. So what is the current situation?
Yeah, thank you for that question. To be honest, nobody would have thought in the 80s that the Federal Republic of Germany would once be governed by East German. Nobody imagines now, can imagine that now in South Korea. I'm just saying that. I'm not deriving anything from it. I'm just saying it. And you have to know that the East Germans who govern the Federal Republic of Germany, Chancellor Merkel, she was not part of the regime. And also the former president of the Federal Republic of Germany, he was a clergyman. So they were in the opposition. So they were highly respected people. And they have the credentials, of course. And they are respected. Chancellor Merkel is one of the most respected persons and politicians, the most respected politician. In all opinion polls, she scores extremely high amongst Germans. And these opinion polls are objective, so it's not a manipulated thing or things like that. But if you look into reality today, of course, there are prejudices. There are prejudices against Saxony. There are prejudices against Bavaria, where I come from. There are, the prejudice against regions, north, south, west, east. But I think this has been mostly overcome, this prejudice we have against the East, they are just used to get money from the state, this receiving mentality they have. This is old thinking. This has been overcome because we see that there has been enormous progress in East Germany. And as I said, there's a lot of migration between both parts. So I think that at the end of the day, perhaps surely we have some prejudices, but this applies to many regions against the other regions, and you have that in every country. I think also here in Korea you have some prejudices between southwest and southeast, and so I think one shouldn't overestimate it. One should take note of it, but I hope that further developments will smooth it over.
Okay, we have a question. Okay, back there first. Would you? Or yes, please start, and then. Okay. And then. Okay, next.
My name is Lim, who is chairman of Diplomacy Magazine. Thank you so much. What is the best way to unify Korea, you think?
It's a very simple question.
Quite a simple question, difficult to answer, but.
Well, as I said, I can't give. I just have the German way, which I can present to you, and it's up to you to derive the lessons from it. But as I said, from my point of view, the German lessons, there are a couple of lessons I would draw from the German unification process, and that is first, the firm embedment of West Germany into the Western Democratic Alliance. That was extremely important, be it the NATO, be it our very close relationship to the United States of America, be it the integration of Germany in the European structures. And as we have the head of the EU ambassador sitting here, I want to say that I think German unification would have been much more difficult, if not impossible, hadn't we had the European integration process. And because the major difference between Germany and the Korean situation is, in my view, we Germans, we caused our own division. We were the perpetrators. You are the victims. You are those who were forced to go into division because you were the victims. So we initiated the war, so we are to blame for our own unification. So this is a major. So we had to win the trust of our partners. The second point is, which you said, is the consistency. You need to pursue a policy which doesn't change with every government. A consistent policy of détente, rapprochement is very important over decades. It can last, and you need to get a quid pro quo. For things you give, you also have to get back other things you want to have and insist on that. And also people-to-people contact, that's extremely important, because then you create this sense of togetherness. This cannot or this is very difficult to establish here and to have it, to keep it here in Korea, because there are no exchanges between North and South. You don't see each other. So it's very important to make this DMZ more permeable so that you cross the DMZ into the North and North can come down. So, but all these issues, to put it on a light note, these lessons, I think Kim Jong-un has closely watched, and this is why he doesn't want people-to-people contact. Because he knows exactly what that would mean for the North Koreans.
Thank you. Please, yes, please. A lot of questions
예,
from the
방금
floor.
강의 잘 들었습니다.
Okay.
그 독일은 사실
잠깐만요.
독일은 1차, 2차 대전, 세계대전 책임이 있기 때문에 그래서 아마 주변국들이 통독이 되는 데 대한 어떤 불안감, 두려움이 있어가지고 힘들었는데 우리 한국은 지금 아시다시피 주변 열강들이 통일 한국을 별로 원치 않는다는 이런 인식들이 많거든요. 과연 주변국들을 어떻게 설득을 해가지고 그런 불안이나 어떤 그름을 할 수 있을지 그게 또 어떤 의견을 주시면 좋겠습니다. 감사합니다.
Got the question. Yes.
Well, thank you very much also for this also very, very good question. Indeed, and as I pointed out in my briefing, it is extremely important to embed unification process into the foreign policy context. This is why we initiated 2+4 process. This is why I just said that it was extremely important to embed German unification into the Western multilateral integrational structures. For Korea, and this is again a major difference between our two countries. The Soviet Union, which was more or less the hegemon of the Eastern Bloc, in particular East Germany, the protector of East Germany, was falling apart. They gave up the Brezhnev doctrine, as I explained, and they were not under control of the East European countries anymore. So they were declining. They were a declining power. Here you have another power which is, getting more and more powerful as we speak, more or less, and more assertive. And they don't really have an interest in a unified Korea, I would say. So it's extremely difficult. But, and this is again brings me back to people-to-people contact. What would they do if North Koreans take to the streets and ask for their political freedoms and democratic rights? This is a process which, if initiated, is very difficult to stop. You cannot handle it. And I hope that I explained in my briefing that the politicians were driven by the events and developments on the streets. They could only react. They couldn't control things. In East Germany, they couldn't control things. And Helmut Kohl took advantage of the situation, jumped on it, and then decided and put forward a process which led to unification. If things come about in the same way here in Korea, on the Korean Peninsula, then it will be difficult for others surrounding to stop that process.
Thank you very much. Professor.
Herr Stefan Ayer, vielen Dank für Ihre Präsentation. Thank you for your presentation. I have a question. Former East Germany is close to East European countries such as Poland and Czechoslovakia, but former East Germany has a same value of currency as West Germany, and East European countries has competence in wage and price. How Germany solved this problem? I knew that many German enterprise built factories in East European countries. So how Germany solve this problem. Thank you.
Yes, that was indeed a big problem after unification, that East German companies were not competitive anymore because the labor costs, the productivity rate was the labor costs were much higher and productivity much lower than in the West or in the surrounding Eastern European countries. And this is why many German companies and other companies, international companies, invested in the other countries or in West Germany, stayed in West Germany. This is exactly the problem. And as I said, we tried to mitigate the social, economic, and political effects of that through transfers, social transfers, and help to infrastructure, which was the basis to attract, again, investments and help enterprises to become more competitive. This took a long, long time. And now we see new enterprises, blossoming in East Germany, in the former industrial centers. They are now very much, into new technologies, green technologies, for instance, renewable technologies. We have BMW, I think, is also active in East Germany. We have the CEO of BMW sitting here, H.J. Kim. So we are. This takes a long process. There was a huge shock in the beginning. And one thing which we shouldn't underestimate and which we need to take more into consideration after achieving political unity, social unity, and economic unity is the effect that shock has had on the people. Just imagine 80% of East Germans lost their job. What that means for a person is very difficult to understand for us. They lost almost everything. The whole system collapsed around them. This is something which has a very strong repercussion on you as a personality. This has been underestimated, what shock that implies for you as a person, as an individual. And now we are getting more aware of that, and we are dealing with that. One shouldn't underestimate that.
Okay, thank you. Perhaps Professor An, would you be the last speaker?
My name is An Chung-young, professor of Zhonghang University. Thank you very much for your presentation. Well, I have one comment and two questions. Before the German unification, I think one of your chancellor, I remember Willy Brandt or Helmut Schmidt was here in Seoul, and he had a press conference, and he was asked a question when German unification would take place. His answer was that never in my life. But unification, after all, happened within next 6 months or something like that. Well, fundamental difference between German case and the Korean case is that the Germans really benefited by the collapse of Soviet Union as the outcome of confrontation, U.S. and Soviet Union during the Cold War period. But Korean case is, I'm very much pessimistic. We are the victim, in a sense, the deep confrontation between United States and China, and this hegemonic power competition between now two, the largest economies and militarily as well as economically will persist many years to come. So as long as this confrontation between between the China and the United States goes on, it is very unlikely to happen, the Korean unification. Okay, that's my first comment. And my question on the post-unification, now what is the per capita income differential between East Germans and the West Germans now? And intra-regional migration, I think you partially commented on that. And then second question is, what is the composition of East Germans who are working in the social, the sort of the elite group in terms of the government cabinet members and other the unified German social elite class, who are basically from the East Germany. I know your Chancellor Merkel, from East Germany. So that's two of my questions.
Thank you very much. US-China confrontation and antagonism is surely a issue which is not helpful for the world, and we hope that this will be overcome. I think I think the Korea Peninsula could, be one point of collaboration between the two sides. It could be. I'm just saying that this could be a possibility of a joint understanding between the two big powers. So I'm perhaps not that pessimistic, because at the end of the day, both have an interest in a stable Korean Peninsula. And they could work together. You should never give up hope, at least. The GDP per capita is a little less. I can't tell you the exact figure, but it has considerably leveled now. It's still not at the same level, but it's on the way of leveling with the West German side. And again, I'm always against, East-West division. We have to overcome that division. We shouldn't always talk about what's the difference between and West. There are also differences between North and South. There are differences within one federal state in Germany. Look at the South. South is very prosperous. The economy is booming there, and we have problems in some parts of the North or in the West German cities. So we have regions which fare quite well economically, and some regions which don't. So it's very difficult always to compare East and West, in my view. When it comes to elite and political leadership, we have some sort of, we look into that in the government are people represented from all groups, if I say so. Women, men, regions. So there's a fair representation and adequate and representative representation in the government, more or less, you could say. Sometimes you ask yourself, why has this politician been appointed minister? Then you know where he comes from or where she comes from. So we try to reflect the whole regions in our government.
Okay, thank you. Now it's time to close. Thank you very much for your stimulating discussion following excellent presentation this morning. Please join me in thanking His Excellency Ambassador Auer for his brilliant presentation today with a round of applause. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. It was a pleasure being here. Thank you.
Excellent. Okay. Thank you so much.